Quran 11:1 says, "This is a book whose verses give clear instructions explained by a wise, knowledgeable Lord." The Quran claims to be clear, decisive, and perfectly constructed. But the true Quran is in Arabic, so how can we know? Far from being a problem, we can use translations to test the Quran's claims. If the Quran really is clear and decisive, then devoted Muslims who translate the Quran into English should give equivalent translations. Not identical words, of course, but the same idea. If different translators describe different ideas, then the meaning of the Quran can't be clear.
Firstly, you're working off of a straw man of what the Quran is saying when it's clear. Muqatil bin Sulaiman, our earliest preserved tafsir for that verse, says when it's called clear, this is about what is lawful and unlawful. Already we're at a bad start with you forcing a reading to the text that was not shared by the earliest generations of Muslims. And if you just had a charitable reading of the whole Quran, you would see this interpretation is the most intuitive type of interpretation. The reason is we have this verse in chapter 3 of the Quran that lays out clearly that some verses will be unclear and some of them will be clear. So now we know when we read chapter 11 verse 1, when it says it's a clear book, that it's clear in general matters such as fundamental doctrines and what is halal and haram. The Quran itself starts many chapters with just letters, like Alif, Lam, Mim, for example. So for you to think that the author actually thinks the whole entire Quran is clear, despite including verses such as this is being highly uncharitable and forcing a contradiction, obviously. And anyways, I explained this to Testify when I spoke to him on his live, and he submitted with no response. So it's highly disingenuous of him to go on and make this video despite already receiving an adequate refutation.
To a higher standard.
No, that's a complete misinterpretation of the text. You really think the Quran means it can explain everything? Like that's.
I don't mean like a literal everything, but I think that it's saying that it's perspicuous. It's saying that it's very perspicuous.
Right. Have you read chapter 3 verse 7 of the Quran? Have you read when it says that there's unclear verses and there's clear verses in the book?
Okay, that's fair enough. That's
right. So
and me as a kuffar here. For example, two translators say, "My cat needs a bath," and "My cat needs to be washed," then that's fine. But if they say, "My cat needs a bath," and "My cat likes to be left alone," then we would wonder why the translators are so confused. If many translators differ like this, there must be something unclear about the original.
Well, that just doesn't follow. I'll give you an example. The Quran says to cut the hands of the thief as a punishment. However, someone who has liberal views once told me the word for cut here in this context means to stop what you're doing, and the punishment in reality is stopping their hands in order for them to be imprisoned. No one early on in Islam ever interpreted it this way, and this violates the apparent reading of the text. The same thing happens here when modern Christians have a problem with the Bible. The Bible is clear that the grape victim has to marry her rapist and live as their wife for as long as he lives after her father gets a cheeky 50 shekels. Christians today render the Hebrew word there as other than grape, but the vast majority of classical and modern scholars render it as grape. Just because some people don't want to accept the apparent meaning and twist the translation, it doesn't then mean the text itself is ambiguous.
In particular, moral guidance should be the most clear and decisive. So let's have a close look at a moral command in the Quran. At IslamAwakened.com, there are 36 generally accepted translations. We'll use this sample. Turn to Quran 434. Here is the first translation at the top of the page. "Men shall take full care of women with the bounties which God has bestowed more abundantly on the former than on the latter, and with what they may spend out of their possessions. And the righteous women are the truly devout ones, who guard the intimacy which God has ordained to be guarded. And for those women whose ill will you have reason to fear, admonish them first, then leave them alone in bed, then beat them. And if thereupon you pay heed, do not seek to harm them. Behold, God is indeed most high great." Anything that is in some kind of bracket has been added by the translator. If it's not in the Arabic, then we'll ignore it because the Arabic Quran is the real Quran.
The reason why it's there is because we have Quranic, Hadith, and early commentaries as points from the earliest Muslims that give it precedence to take it as a light meaning. Firstly, the Quranic evidence is from the story of Job. In the story of Job, peace be upon him, he got infuriated by his wife for doubting God and took an oath by God while he was in his ailment that he would beat her 100 times if he was ever cured from it. He later felt bad about his oath once his ailment had been cured, and Allah agreed with his sentiment because instead of having him beat her harshly, he told Job to fulfill his oath with blades of grass. Interestingly enough, the same root word for beat in this context with blades of grass is the same for Quran 434, which is the verse in question. Secondly, the Prophet, peace be upon him, told us the type of beating here is one that doesn't cause harm. This is found in a Sahih hadith that isn't some modern reinterpretation. Ibn Abbas, the cousin of the Prophet, peace be upon him, says this is equivalent to the harshness of using a toothbrush. And here's a video showing an example. The point here is that the woman didn't listen to verbal reprimandation, so physical contact that isn't harmful is the last step and last resort before divorce is then initiated. Our earliest tafsir of the Quran, yet again, Muqatil bin Sulaiman, tells us the same thing, that it's a beat that doesn't cause harm. So if this was commonly understood by Muslims very early on, and there's no reason for them to sugarcoat the religion because the culture at the time was one where harsh beatings were normal. So clearly this was the intended interpretation early on. And actually a revered Catholic theologian, Thomas Aquinas, a doctor of the church, believes you can deal blows to your wife if she commits the act of fornication. So even biblically, it's not clear to Christian scholars that beating harshly is prohibited.
So let's focus on this. What is the third command for dealing with a woman whose ill will you have reason to fear? This translation says beat them. Is the Arabic so clear and decisive though? Let's take a look at some other translations to see. Of the 36 translations, 15 say to beat your wife. That's 42%. That's less than 50, so let's look at the other options. 5 translations say to strike your wife, 2 say to hit your wife, 1 says to spank your wife, 1 says to scourge your wife, 1 says to apply force to your wife. It says a minimum of force, but the word minimum is not in the Arabic text. There are no further instructions. Further, 2 translations say to discipline or chastise your wife. With no further instructions in the Quran, the method seems up to you.
As I mentioned before, the story of Job, the hadith from the Prophet upon him be peace, and our earliest understandings from Muslims all corroborate an understanding that it can't do harm to the woman. We are Sunnis, we're not Quranists. We take from the tradition, and we don't claim every detail of a command will be in the Quran. You need tradition as well.
Count those as consistent with beating. That's a total of 27 out of 36 translations, or 75%, that say to beat, scourge, beat, discipline, hit, beat, strike, beat, strike, hit, beat, chastise, spank, apply force, beat your wife. If they were all like this, then the command of the Quran would be clear and decisive about beating your wife. To be clear, there are no further instructions about how to beat your wife. There is nothing in the Arabic about a last resort, or gently, or not in their faces, or even if necessary, or with a toothbrush. It just says beat your wife. However, they don't all agree that you should beat your wife. 7 translations say that you should separate, turn away, go away from them, depart, or withdraw. That's very different. By a strange coincidence, all 7 translations were created in the 21st century. 1 translation says to keep admonishing your wife, which means only to use words. That's very different. Finally, Ahmed Ali says go to bed with him. That seems like wishful thinking. Nice try, Ahmed. So
there are possible readings and probable readings of a text. The apparent readings are always the most probable. Part of you determining the apparent reading is to see how the earliest people understood it. The translations testify provided are modern reinterpretations, obviously, and the Quran is clear that a beat occurs, but how it's done is in the example of the Prophet, as the Prophet, peace be upon him, is said to be the walking Quran, and therefore how to practice the Quran is by his example. One example of possible and probable readings is Mark 10:18, where Jesus denies being good. Apologists like Testify in the modern age will insist it isn't excluding Jesus, but when you look at the earliest interpretations of the church fathers, they all refer this goodness to the Father alone. This makes Testify's reading a possible reading and not a probable one, because it violates the apparent reading of the text and contradicts the earliest understandings of the Christians. In Testify's case, however, it has theological ramifications, with his merely possible and ad hoc reinterpretation and ignoring of an interpretation that fundamentally undermines Jesus' divinity. So it's a lot worse than what these modern Muslims are doing in translating the Quran in a distorted fashion for a jurisprudential purpose.
Is the Quran clear and decisive? There are 3 options. Number 1, the Quran is not clear and decisive. We don't know whether the original Arabic Quran is trying to command you to beat your wife, or to separate from her, or something else. That's why the translations are so divided. So, the Quran's claim to be clear and decisive is false. Number 2, the Quran is clear and decisive. You should beat your wife if you have any reason to fear her ill will. In that case, Other translations show that devout Muslims today are perfectly okay with mistranslating the Quran to make it more acceptable to 21st century audiences. Why should I trust any Muslim translation of the Quran if Muslims are perfectly okay with twisting the meaning?
Perfect. I don't want you to take the modern Muslims' reinterpretations of the Quran to justify their modern ideal. But just because a group of Muslims are modern people that want to reinterpret the Quran, it doesn't mean that all of them are to be seen as deceptive. As you showed, the majority of the translations don't have this modern reinterpretation or modern type of translation. The majority render it as be. By the same standard, also, I should reject the later developed interpretations of Jesus' words, like in the example I gave in Mark 10:18. Just because there's people like you testify who reinterpret that passage and give modern distortions of the apparent reading, it doesn't mean I'm not going to take the readings from Unitarians or Jehovah's Witnesses who have better interpretations of the passage by saying that Jesus isn't actually God.
Number 3, the Quran is clear and decisive. You should separate from your wife if you have any reason to fear her ill will, but that creates a problem. If the Quran is clear and decisive, where did almost every translator before the 21st century get the idea that you should beat your wife? In any case, it should be clear that relying on the Quran for moral guidance is a terrible idea. If it's not clear, that's bad. And if it is clear, that's even worse.
So our position would just be that generally the Quran is clear on matters of fundamental doctrines and what is halal and haram. The details of specificities, you must go to the tradition and the scholars and other Quran verses in the Arabic to inform your understanding on how to perform these actions. The Quran mandates that a man has authority over a woman, and this includes lightly physically admonishing her as a last resort to preserve the marriage. We don't have any problem with that, and we're unapologetic about that. If you want to have direct contact to myself, have my notes on the early church fathers that would be useful in discourses and are personally written by myself with hours of research into them, then just become a Patreon member down below for $10 a month, and I'll send you the link for the Discord so you can join. The server will also have weekly lessons, and this week, inshallah, we'll have Brother Farid Responds to come on to discuss hadith reliability. The support on the Patreon will support the dawah immensely, and my GoFundMe and PayPal links will be put down below as well for generous donations. Jazakallah khair for the support. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Me, as a kuffar here,